Whatever you guys want to do. Sure? Yeah, sounds good. Thank you. Good evening, everyone. Tonight is a work session of the South Kingstown Planning Board. The date is Tuesday, May 9, 2023. It is now 3 minutes past 7. We'll do roll call first. Joe Murphy. Here. Paul Jordan.
Here.
Susan Axelrod.
Here.
Peter DiStefano. Here. Liz Carp.
Here.
Robin Pothier. And Maria Mack is here. Our first agenda item, which we have moved up, item C, is going to actually go before B, is continuing education for planning board members. We have Andy Tights, legal counsel, here this evening, who is going to give us another training session. All right, someone has to decide. Are you okay with that?
And Andy, at the appropriate time, I have a question for you about the last training, which I did watch online.
Oh, great. Thank you. But they're double-sided, so brownie points.
So I was watching the training, and you'll tell me if I'm wrong. At some point, I think you used the term competent testimony, and it was about, an engineer comes in and presents a drainage plan and says, this is going to work, all the water's going to go away, you have nothing to worry about, it meets all the DEM standards. And the planning board can't disagree with that. We're not experts, the engineer is. And I thought that you said if, on the other hand, all of the neighbors said, look, here are photos of all the standing water there every time it rains. Yowza. Shocking. That could be taken as evidence that the engineer might not be correct. And I may have misunderstood it, but.
Well, yes and no. So it's competent testimony, and yes, that's the idea that it's from an expert. And there is a case, Restivo versus East Providence, which did talk about that. But again, I think you have to be careful what you're looking at. If the engine, obviously, if it's future calculations based on development, then the engineer can't be refuted by photographs or something like that. But if, as part of the engineer's calculation, testimony says, oh, it's perfectly dry now, there's no problems, and then you've got photographs that show it's not, yes, it can be refuted by that. So you have to kind of draw that distinction between them. Thank you. I am starting, that's a good question. I am starting right here. According to my notes, I'm starting at land use reviews, but I don't have page numbers. We, after ethics and recusals, yeah, that looks like. What page that is? Just the curiosity, I was curious. It seems strange. I did definitely jump around, and I definitely jumped around farther out, and I skipped the history of, a little bit about us. I skipped about who statewide planning is. So, So yeah, so we're starting at the thing that says land use reviews. But, I mean, you don't, this is more for you to have as a backup resource rather than to follow along now, because, as we were saying, I jumped around before, and I'm going to jump around a little bit here, too. So let me just, can I take this? Okay. All right, what do I, just the arrows will? Up, down, left, right, we'll do it too, right? Okay. All right. So we're going to, as I did, I skipped around before, hit most of the highlights, but we'll just hit some of the general stuff so that we can do it. Land use review process. So confusing as to which one of these I should look at, but what's the purpose? To maintain consistency between land use changes, the comprehensive plan, and ordinance regulations. The applicant must submit information, witnesses, and materials to prove that the request meets the standards for review. The public body or staff evaluates all the information received and entered into the record, and to determine whether standards of review have been met. And obviously, those italicized words there on the screen, those are all terms of art that we talk about with the different sessions here. Land use review is just basically a catch-all, any kind of consideration of a land development request. So, depending on the type of request, might be conducted by public body, which would be you guys, or municipal staff, or could be in between, could be the technical review committee, which has both staff from the municipality and members of the planning board on it. Excuse me. So we've got the application packet. The application, we call it the packet, I mean, basically, that is all the stuff that's being provided to you, and generally today, we also provide all that information to the public, usually online. Usually you can go to the website somewhere, the town, and find, here's the packet for a particular application. It is not necessarily the same thing as the record. There can be the record can be broader than the packet. There are certain things that don't necessarily, for example, if there are different iterations of plans, earlier plans, they change, and the later plans, and then the final plans, all those plans are part of the record. They're all public documents. If somebody comes in and says, I want to see what the first version of the plan looked like, they're public document. But you wouldn't put them on the website as someone's coming in and the hearing is several months later and they're on the third iteration of the plans. It's only going to be confusing if there's all these different plans there. So probably you'd have for your packet for that meeting would only be the current generation of plans. So the record is something that's a little bit broader than the packet. Other stuffs are all there, application forms, drawings, photographs, state permits, staff reports, site inspection information, et cetera. That's all the stuff that you get. What we used to get in the big, huge brown envelopes. And you could always tell when people came into the meeting and hadn't unsealed the envelope yet, how well prepared they were. So that actually gets to preparing for a meeting. Read the contents thoroughly. At least read them. Look at them. Take the time to, open it up ahead of time and take a look at what's there. Even if you can't read them all thoroughly, at least, skim through the stuff to see what you get. Do you understand what standards of review apply, what procedural step you are? If it has stuff you don't understand, contact the planning office and ask questions. Remember, you can't contact each other. That's a no-no. But you absolutely can contact your staff members and ask them about various issues about it. Ask yourself if you have enough information to demonstrate that the standards have been met. If not, you're probably thinking, well, what am I still missing? What do I want to be hearing from the applicant at this next hearing? Reading staff reports and recommendations. There we go. Okay. Best practice for checklists, for reviewing an application, just talking about different elements of it, things that are there. A lot of this stuff may or may not be applicable. From, obviously, the comprehensive plan, the zoning ordinance, and the subdivision regs are all applicable, but other stuff like landscaping or circulation pattern or whatnot might not be applicable depending on the particular application. Site visits. I am a big proponent of site visits. And we're lucky that Rhode Island is so small. So we don't have the excuse, well, we got to get in a plane and travel 2 hours to go for the site visit. Everything's around here. It's usually pretty easy to do. I know we have really great technology now. We have Google Earth, we have GIS maps, we have soils maps. We don't really need to go out there and see it. But I disagree. I think that oftentimes there's no substitute for actually getting out there and walking the land itself. Now, it's not always necessary, particularly, if it's something downtown Wakefield and you drive by it twice a day anyway, everybody knows it. It may be enough just to make sure you're slowing down one of these times as you drive by or pulling over to the sidewalk, taking a look at it. You don't have to have a formal site visit. Might not always be possible. It's 100 acres of swamp. But generally, I think it's a good idea with major developments to try and do a site visit. And it's a way to allow you as a public body, because you can go together and you can see it together. And if the public wants to go with you, they can. Remember, they have the right to listen and hear what you say. They don't have any right to participate. They don't have any right to speak up at a site visit. It's not a public hearing. And you have to be careful as you're, talking to the applicant, make sure that the audience can hear what you're being told by the applicant and that you're really not getting into a dialogue discussion there. You want to make sure it's all out in public. Some particulars here about getting permission, properly notice as a public meeting. Minutes can be simple. All minutes can be simple, but particularly with a site visit, need to make sure you have who's there, make sure you get a roll call, everybody attend, call the meeting to order. If there's any particular motions that are held at the thing, obviously that needs to be taken down. And it can be just a rough discussion. We started on the southwest corner and then, walked over towards the southeast corner and then came back to the roadway or something like that. Doesn't have to be detailed descriptions. Go ahead. Yes. It's a meeting, you got to have minutes. They don't have to be detailed, but you do have to have minutes. No, you don't. So, go ahead.
So for some site visits, we've been told, go on your own and poke around, and you have permission to do that. I'm just wondering exactly where the line is for the owner who's there, who wants to show you where the stuff is going to happen, and can there be a conversation, and where exactly, in the real time, is that line drawn between what you're allowed to, any conversation you're allowed to have with the landowner or the neighbor who comes over who has something to say? Where exactly is that line drawn for appropriate or inappropriateness?
Right. So I think that's a good question. And so if you're alone, that's the line. You shouldn't be having conversations with anybody if you're alone. You might have to have the barest conversation with the applicant, where's the site, can you show, how do I get to the back to see it? But you don't want to have conversations with the applicant, and you don't want to have conversations with the neighbor, because since it's not a public meeting, the public doesn't have the ability to hear what you're being told. You're receiving information and evidence, and they don't have that ability to listen and watch when that happens. If you go as a group, they have, and are told the same thing, they have the ability to go as well and can hear what's being told to you. So at least, when they come back in at a next meeting, public information meeting or public hearing, they can refute that. I heard the neighbor next door say X, but in fact it's Y. And here's why it is that way. So if you're alone, you really shouldn't have any of those conversations. I guess we put in the applications that they give permission for people, is that in our application, that they give permission for individuals to come on board? If we don't have it in the application, basically, you shouldn't really be on the private property, you should only be looking at it from the street. And obviously, with large areas and, big developments, you need to get on the property, which is another reason to do it as a group, as a site visit.
I've also found that regardless of how much you scrutinize the maps, there's nothing like being at the site to really understand the topography and some of the differences that may be seen depending on what time of year it is with regard to vegetation. And then the other thing is that often we'll see a plan, and then when it's built, even though we know what the setback is and we know what the height of the building is and the footprint, you're never always prepared to really understand the mass and the scale until it's actually built. At least that's how I feel. Liz probably gets it because.
No, I think it's always a little bit never in your mind.
Maria, I will say from a department standpoint, from my perspective as your director, I will not comment on a site or put my name to any letter or any item coming out of our department if I have not physically been on the site. That is a change from what the department has done in the past. But if you cannot just, to Maria's point,
Exactly.
A professional planner, in my professional opinion, cannot do a thorough review of just looking at site plans. I have refused contracts and consulting jobs where the developer just wanted me to look at plans. I just professionally would not do it and will not do it for you. We're trying to be thorough.
So let's just also talk about one thing that's there on the, on the lower left. Talk about individual visit observations submitted into the record. So if you do go alone and you see something and you're discussing it, whether this be during a hearing or actually, that's the point. It shouldn't be after the hearing's closed and you're deliberating and you say, well, when I went down there, I saw this. You should be getting that information out during the public hearing part so that particularly the applicant or the opponents have the ability to respond if you say something. You can certainly say that. This is what I saw when I went on the property, but you need to identify that, get that on the record as part of when it's still in a hearing stage so that other people can respond to it. If you wait until it's deliberating on the decision, they can't dispute that at all. So that's important to remember. And, what you saw, so, why you have your opinion based on what you saw. Best practices, it is a good idea to have their surveyor or engineer present, who, if you can give an overview, and obviously have the plans with you if you need to look. No lobbying. Take video or photos. That's very important. Nowadays, it's so easy with one's phone. That's the way to do it. I know I actually have done, during COVID, I did a few hybrid site visits. We were outside, so it was okay during COVID, but we also had them on Zoom, so we were walking around with the iPad or the phone and doing the site visit. And if you do that, just be conscious, the person, whoever's recording, be conscious of stay close to the person who's talking so you can pick up the voices on it and make sure to aim at what people are pointing at or looking at rather than just looking at the other people or looking down at your feet. Carry identification that proves you're a member, and examine the maps and stuff beforehand. Public hearings. Begin the meeting by introducing the board. That's a nice thing to do. Explain the purpose, make sure people know what stage you're at, what the rules are, and what the state law and, what your curfew is going to be, how long you're going to go out at tonight, and so forth. explain who's going what, order of testimony, time limits if you're going to have it. Consider setting an ending time for the hearing, and explain continuance procedures. I don't know about specifically continuance procedures, but going along with the time limit. Like, if we don't finish tonight, we'll continue it to another night. Or it may be, our time limit is running, the applicant has refused to extend it, so we're going to stay here and get this done if it takes all night. It's late August, it's the end of August, and some school is opening, I guess it was the zoning board, some school is opening the next Monday, and we got to reach an answer even if we're here till 12:45 at night. Chairperson is key to effective hearing. Maintain order, maintain focus, facilitate public hearing, ensure everyone's heard. State motions made, call for seconds, et cetera. Best practice, sequence of events, presentation of the application, summary of issues, present details, et cetera here. So this doesn't really talk about two things here that I want to really provide detailed suggestions on. One is realize when you do have organized opposition that's represented by an attorney and their own experts, you need to give them an opportunity. You can't just say, well, the applicant's got 3 hours, they've taken 3 hours to present their case, opposition, everybody's got 5 minutes. If you've got that kind of opposition with experts and whatnot, you have to let them take their time to present it as well. Also, it helps if you can get that in first, before general public comment, because a lot of the things that the general public comment would say will probably be dealt with by the experts. If you just let the general comment come in first, you could very easily have a whole nother meeting that didn't have to happen worth of just the public comments that are being brought up by the expert and their attorney on the opposition. The other thing is, my advice, it's not law, but it's practical. Don't get into debates with the people on the other side of the table, whether it's the applicant or the objectors. If they're asking questions, don't answer. The objectors are asking questions. It's not your job to answer those questions. It's your job to make sure that the applicant knows that they're going to be responsible for answering the questions. And they should be told that, okay, we're going to hear all the questions. You take a list of those questions, because when they're done, and staff may do it as well, take a list of the questions and the issues, and then have the applicant back up from rebuttal and respond to them. But if you do it one at a time, you will be there forever. It will be months to do it. And it just doesn't work. All you're going to do is annoy everyone. You're going to get into people will ask you the question and you'll give them what you think is a perfectly good answer, but then they'll argue with you about your answer. So I strongly urge you not to get into debates and discussion with the audience. That's not your role. Your role is to hear it, do it. Feel free to, if you hear good questions, and the applicant doesn't answer them or address them, absolutely, you go grill the applicant on what someone said. If they're dancing around it and not answering it, you grill the applicant on it. But don't debate back and forth. So, I was at a meeting recently of another planning board with a very large, multi-hundred unit development, and the applicant was presenting their traffic report. And the members of the planning board, but many of them disagreed with many factors of the traffic report, including, how far out did you go? You only went to this intersection here. Why didn't this road leads only one way to this other intersection? Why didn't you look at that other intersection? And the answer was given, well, we scoped it out with the planning director, and in our expert opinion, we felt that wasn't necessary to do. And then the planning was started, but it should have been, and it was a back and forth argument, and it just was each side repeating, but we think you should have done it, and the other person saying, no, I don't think I needed to do it. And so finally, I stepped in and I pointed out, look, this is master plan. You've asked the questions, you've determined, you've asked why, and in fact, the, peer review has commented as well on it. The town's peer review traffic expert has commented on it. There's no need to keep going back and forth on it. It's master plan. If the majority of you believe that it should go out to a farther intersection, you can make that a condition of your preliminary plan submission, that they have to, update their traffic report to do this or that. So that's what you need to remember. You have that ability to do those things, which will be much more effective than arguing back and forth with the parties. Questions before I?
So I have a question about something you just said. So I'm not happy with the level of the traffic study. So I tell them, you need to do that traffic study when you come back at preliminary. But I'm vesting it at master, right? So do I then have the option to claw it back if what they bring at preliminary isn't satisfying to what I was hoping to see? Or have they vested and now we're just going to sort of let it slide? Like, I guess I don't understand the mechanics of,
If it's a specific condition of the master plan decision, then they're not vested. You have not accepted their traffic plan as is if you have made it a condition of your master plan decision, that you shall go out to, you shall go all the way out to the corner of Route 138 and Route 1 and study that intersection as well. Now, I will say, this is hard to say, but you do have to be reasonable. There were people there talking about the level of traffic on Interstate 95. And it's like, okay, that's not reasonable to say, but certainly with intersections and so forth and how far out you go. If you just say it in the discussions and don't have it in your decision, then yes, it's vested, then you can't force it before. I think we talked a little bit decision, we didn't actually get to decisions. We were just ending there the last time. So this is really key. It's important, and this is where staff is really important, to keep track of all these conditions and also everything that the applicant agrees to do during the course of the meetings, so that when the decision is written, you get them there. If it doesn't get put down on the decision, it doesn't legally exist.
and so it doesn't say that you will perform a traffic study. It needs to say specifically, and the traffic study that you perform will show
Yes,
this result.
exactly.
Be very, very,
Well,
Concise.
I don't think you can say what result it will show, but you
it'll show that
must
there isn't an unsafe.
condition, right, yes. But you can specify that. Or, for example, we all know the traffic studies that are done next to schools in the summertime, or the traffic studies that are done along the beaches that are done in the wintertime. So, we recently, we had one in Bristol, and we said, and fortunately, it was spring when we were there with master plan, and we said, preliminary plan, you shall do a supplement during the summer. We want a supplemental traffic study during the July or August to see about the summer traffic as part of it. The more specific you can be about what you're looking for, the better.
I think, just if I can follow up on Susan's question, it's the submission of additional information, but with an underlying criteria. So if you ask for additional traffic information to study another intersection, which has level of service B, and it's going to level of service C, it just means it's slightly more congested. It doesn't mean it fails or it's unsafe. So, again, your ability to deal with public safety, just because there's an increase of traffic, doesn't mean that the development makes the community less safe. It may make it a little more congested at 4 o'clock, and you may have to go through 2 queues at a signal, but the signal and the travel lanes and the turning movements are 100% functional and 100% safe. So I think to to take Susan's question one more, Andy,
Yeah.
is pushing it off to another phase of review doesn't necessarily give you any more approval or denial capabilities than it did in the initial phase, unless you specifically, and again, this is the framework, does the planning board have the ability to say, your report says it's a level of service C, I'm gonna deny it, it becomes any less than level C, even though it's safe. It just means the gaps are less, the congestion's more, the
Right.
queuing's more likely to occur.
Right, and I think that's why I was saying, I don't think you can say, what the result must be, other than a general thing of, it's not, you gotta make sure that it's safe. But that is very important with traffic. It's not a question, it's not like on drainage. On drainage, they can't increase the rate or quantity of stuff that's leaving a property if they're developing it. Whatever's coming off that property now in sheet flow can stay the same, but they don't have to improve it, but they can't make it worse. Those are the DEM regs. They have to make sure it's no worse than what's there now. Traffic, if you have development, you're probably going to have quote-unquote worse traffic. You're going to have delay. Your 5-minute drive may become a 10-minute drive because of the increase in population. And part of it, I touched on this last time, and, part of it is the good planning with the town, that we've concentrated a lot of the development in the urban cores where the urban services and the infrastructure is. But that will make traffic more congested in those areas. But that's not a reason for denial. It really, you really have to get down to E or F levels of traffic congestion before it's the congestion alone that can do it. There are other issues like sight distance, safe sight stopping distance, and things like that that are important on their own as well. And I think what I'm talking about more is requiring elements of the traffic study are when they're just, for example, if they're making assumptions, they assume that 90% of the traffic coming out of this in the morning is going to go north, only 10% south. Therefore, they didn't study the intersection that was only 100 yards further south because they assumed everything was going north. You can say, okay, we want you to study that intersection in the south because, we don't disagree. That's kind of a judgment call that the traffic engineer is making about which way people are going to go in the morning. Partly it's based on existing flow. If there's an existing development, they'll measure what the existing split is and they'll extrapolate that. But that's the sort of thing that you can require. But you can't require, say, you've got to study this and it can't get any worse than it is now. Traffic can get worse without it being grounds for denial.
So thank you.
Go ahead.
So I know we have a schedule to keep, but I really want to understand that if you say that you want a new traffic study on that other intersection in the other direction, there's really no chance, though, that request is going to change the ultimate outcome of approval or denial of a project, unless that other intersection is like -F failing. And so we're asking for that additional step, but it really isn't going to change the outcome of the ultimate project.
It might. There might be safety issues at the other intersection. There might be structural issues at the other intersection. So that, a condition of approval is that they have to, realign that intersection or something like that. Conceivably, a traffic light, if there is one, or a turning lane or something like that, depending on the scale of what we're talking about.
So if it drops, yeah. And that's not our decision, that's a formula that comes up during traffic study that determines that now needs to be, we
Yes.
don't have that,
Right.
Okay.
That's why you have the applicant's traffic engineer study that, and then the town's peer review person to review it.
Right, so it could influence design. And then the case of stormwater, which Jamie brought up, which say has not been sufficiently vetted at master plan, you could put a carefully worded condition in your approval that states something to the effect that, based on future stormwater calculations to be presented at preliminary, something to the effect that the board may require changes to the design layout, which may or may not include density. So as long as it's carefully crafted, you can manage the aspect of the vesting versus the lack of information that you might have at master plan.
Yes.
And I would agree with Andy on that, because in most aspects, what you're seeing at master plan is 3 different parabolas on a site plan that is just labeled stormwater detention area. They haven't necessarily been sized for a particular storm. I mean, Mr. Jordan had a copy of a site development that's being looked at in the very early stages in another municipality. It's relatively dense, 5 units per acre. And on that plan, which is well landscaped, well articulated with regards to the vision of the development, there is just these squiggly areas that say stormwater basin. To Andy's point, if that basin required to be twice as big as that parabola that was showed on the initial plan, I think it'd be hard pressed for the developer to say, but I still need to put the unit, it'll just be on stilts now on top of the detention basin, where you can say, no, the basin has to get bigger, and therefore where you had units, 33, 34, and 35, they need to either be removed or your design needs to change. And in most instances, they'll change the design and try and squeeze those 3 units somewhere else. But I think you do have that ability, specifically on stormwater, because stormwater is not specifically calculated at master plan.
Yes. Well, so I think that was a good thing. He certainly is at preliminary plan. He is going to be doing it and commenting, absolutely. Master plan, I think, as often forgotten, it really is supposed to be more of an overview and a master plan. And I know the tendency as human beings is, and particularly sitting here on the board, we always want more information. But think of it this sense, to the extent the developer goes and does a lot of more work before master plan than is otherwise required, such as the drainage calculations and the traffic study and all that beforehand for master plan, and comes in, and you look at it and you have suggestions which you think can improve it, and that developer has already spent $150,000 on all this stuff, he or she is not going to have any desire to listen to you about any changes whatsoever. The earlier that you can get the developer to come in, the better. I mean, that's why pre-application is important. I mean, that's why we're fighting to try to keep it in the state law. Pre-application should be before they've really spent much money at all. Get them in, talk to them, give some guidance. And even then, the idea with master plan is it's to help both sides before they've spent a lot of money. So requiring someone to do more of these studies, or when they jump the gun and do it themselves anyway ahead of time, often ends up with a countervailing effect in that they won't be willing to compromise at all since they've already invested too much money. If they've only invested $10,000 in the plans, they're much more willing to change them than if they've invested $100,000 in them.
So I think the real concern that we all have is not getting locked into something at master plan and then a preliminary being told, well, you already agreed to that.
Well, I mean, That's why I'm saying, I think you have to be specific and make sure the conditions are set forth by to which you are not approving as part of the master plan. You're approving the general layout, you're approving these numbers, but it's based on that everything else will fall into place that they have to have. Some of that stuff you don't have to, like, statutory, like CRMC. If they can't get CRMC approval, it doesn't matter what you granted, or DEM or DOT or something like that. And then if there's specific things here like the traffic or whatnot, then you can, if they've mentioned it, or you can even bring it out beforehand. A condition is a traffic study done during the summertime, during the beach season, if it's down on the shore. You can let them know right ahead at master plan, saying, make sure you do that traffic study in the summertime. We don't want you coming in here with a traffic study you did in November.
And isn't that why the correct name is actually conceptual master plan? Because it's supposed to be a concept, and it allows them to dip their toe, or a little more than their toe, into the water, because they have that vesting. But that way, they can make the decision of whether or not to continue and spend all the resources that may be required for a preliminary approval.
So I have one more question. I know we want to move on. So we are a summer community with crazy beach traffic. I'm looking at a project in October. How can I tell you to do a summer July traffic study before we can approve this project? Like, that's 10 months out. Like, what's the deal with the timing?
Well, I guess,
Or better, or URI traffic. This thing comes to us in May, and URI is not in session until September. What's the deal with timing with that?
well, I think, for the most part, that's what I'm saying. If you can get them at master plan and make sure you get those concerns in your master plan, they're not coming back for a while for preliminary anyway. I think it might be, I guess that's, you can make something a condition of master plan approval, that they have to have such and such in order to come back for preliminary. And there isn't a time frame on that. If you force them because of that to have to wait 6 months before they come back, there's no time frame running then. If you didn't get it at master plan and you're in preliminary and the clock is running, then you can have a problem. Or that's the sort of thing where you're going to deny it. You're going to deny it because you're going to find that their traffic plan is not credible, and therefore they haven't met their burden of proof, demonstrating that there won't be traffic safety hazards, and it's going to be a reason for denial.
And to Andy's point, in some aspects, if we'll take another municipality in Rhode Island, if you're traveling down Route 4 southbound on a Saturday morning trying to get to Newport in June or July, you just took a 15-minute travel time and probably made it an hour and 15. The level of service went from an A in some aspects to an F with regards to delay. It didn't mean the road became any less safe. It meant that the delay increased. And what departments of transportations and municipalities struggle with all the time is you would never build Route 4 to accommodate the traffic in that scenario on a Saturday on the July 4th weekend, because it'd be a level of service A, and then for the rest of the year, you would have 6 lanes northbound, 6 lanes southbound, and all this infrastructure. So, but there's a balance there. So one thing that traffic engineers do all the time is states have automatic counters. They have average daily traffic counts, typically in some areas that occur daily, if not monthly, and they are able to extrapolate a summer condition even though they may be submitting a traffic or an application in December, that they can look at a number. Now, it may be believable or not, but it gives them a good idea of what happens at a particular intersection with 50% more throughput between 9 and 11 o'clock in the morning because of beach traffic. They're doing that with COVID because the traffic counts over 2020, pushing 2022, have been depressed. So everybody's adding a factor, that COVID factor, and adding 10 to 15% to all of their counts that existed in that time frame, understanding they've been depressed. So there are ways to react to the fact that you're off-season, but again, there's a delay factor versus a safety factor.
I'll just point out as a planning thing too, the idea of, you know, if you improved, if you keep widening the roads, you know, you can have supply-induced demand. I remember I don't know how many of you remember Route 1, when it really used to be only, it wasn't 4 lanes, it was really 2 lanes because the high-speed lane was so broken with pavement and it's so rough, it was essentially a 2-lane road. And then you had to deal with the rotary. So a lot of people who might have liked to live in South Kingstown but work every day in Providence would not move to South Kingstown because of that. Now we smooth it out, make it a much smoother ride, and we have a lot more people who are taking the ride and slowing it down. I mean, that's the classic example, you know, of Los Angeles. Keep building the highways wider, and all you do is suck more people onto the highway. So, all right, let's move on so we can stay somewhat on track. We're talking now about just the hearing still, verbatim records. You've got your sound recording. Now we've got video on most things, so it's good. It still is important to try to make sure that witnesses, make sure everybody is giving them their name and their address. So you've got that for the record. If somebody comes up a second time, make them give their name and address a second time, so you've got it. So if someone is transcribing this, they're able to do it. Continuing or closing a hearing, assuming that you have time before the deadline would run, if you determine that, you know, you haven't had everybody had a chance to be heard, or there's not sufficient information on the record, continue the hearing. If it's continued, you want to make sure you get a motion, and you want to make sure that you continue it to a specific time and place and date. If you don't do that, you got to re-notice everybody. So you want to make sure when you're continuing it. So now maybe not everybody is in the room or not in the room or whatnot, but the idea is that everybody who wanted to be heard, who cared about it, would be in the room and would hear you say exactly when it's being continued to, and then you don't have to provide that new notice to them that the planning statutes require with postcard or mail or newspaper. You always have to still comply with the Secretary of State's notice. That's only 48 hours, and that's not, you know, individual notice. If you have everything, then close the hearing, and, you know, move on so you can discuss. Just realize, once you've closed the hearing, you can't keep talking to people other than your staff. You can talk to your legal counsel, you can talk to your planners, part of the discussion, but you can't take new stuff from the developer or new stuff from the audience or anything like that. So if you think you are going to be taking it, you know, then you want to continue it. And one of the things you could do, it's more of a zoning board thing than a planning board thing, but you could also, okay, we're going to close the verbal part, oral part of the public hearing now, and we'll give people 10 days to submit anything else they want in writing. You know, if you want to ask the applicants, you want to, you know, particularly if you've got lawyers on both sides, give us your closing briefs. We'll give you till whatever time to submit those. So that way you kind of have a hybrid meeting closing the public hearing. Your deliberation is your participatory discussion, and, you know, you should go through the standards and decide what's there. You want to make sure that everybody has a chance to be heard. Differences of opinion are explained. Everyone participates, including alternates. The alternates don't vote, but they still participate in the discussion. No one dominates the discussion or intimidates other board members. I'm sure that never happens anywhere in Rhode Island. I will say, again, kind of as I'm saying with, you know, don't get into, I said, don't get into debates with the audience. You can get into debates with each other. That's what you're there for. You're a deliberate body, you're a deliberative body, and, you know, it is in fact part of your role to try to convince the other members of the board that your position is correct. But don't take it too far. It's usually pretty obvious after a few minutes if someone is receptive to an argument and you can work back and forth and do it, or if you're just repeating the same arguments over and over. So try not to let that get out of hand. As I said, it's your role. That's what, it's a democracy. That's your role to debate this stuff. But don't let it drag down the whole process. Did I? Yes. Okay, sorry. Findings of fact. Okay, so this is, I think I may have told you, there's like 2 things you absolutely must remember from this training. One of them is no use of reply all, okay? That's, if you learn 2 things and 2 things only, you got to remember, that's one. Don't use reply all. The second one is here. Findings of fact, and you see that word in the bold, because, okay? It's not a finding of fact if it doesn't include the word because, and it doesn't include, because we in English we write from left to right, it's got to include something to the right of the word because where all those little periods are. That's what a finding of fact is. A finding of fact is not a recitative. Finding of fact is not that, you know, the applicant has applied plans dated April 13th, 2023, pages 1 through 5. Those can be part of your decision. Those are part of the formula. You want to have that, what's the basis for the decision, but it's not a finding of fact. A finding of fact is not that, you know, there will be no harm to the environment after all mitigation factors of final plan. That's not a finding of fact. It's got to have because, you know, there will be no harm to the environment because it's a flat parcel of land with no wetlands and serviced by public water and sewer. That's kind of like the, or, you know, we find that there will be harm to the environment because, you know, it is on a 40-degree slope and it's sitting on ledge and there's no availability. The applicants have not provided proof that wells could be adequately installed to provide drinking water for the public, whatever. You want to get those becauses when you have your findings of fact. And if we're talking about comp permits, you know, safety, public safety and health to the residents, both the existing residents and the new residents. And as we said, you know, increase in traffic alone is not, you know, a grounds for denial. That's not a public, it's got to be a specific public health and safety concern that would do it, you know, because this is a development that as the applicants, you know, the applicant's expert testified that these units will have approximately 1.5 children per unit, and yet the area contains not a single playing area for children. You know, okay, there's something specific why this isn't going to be good for the health and safety of those residents, and therefore we're going to deny it. But that's what you need. You got to get the because, something after the because, and try to get it specific.
On the findings, one of the findings that we always have to approve or deny is no significant, no negative environmental impacts. Do you think that that is often either subjective or not thoroughly discussed, or, you know, have that because of X, Y, or Z?
Well,
that concerns me often.
Yeah, I mean, well, I mean, it is subjective. I mean, there's going to be some, you know, every development that takes a vacant parcel filled with deer and rabbits now is going to have some negative environmental consequence when it's replaced with lawns and houses. So I don't think it can be totally objective. I think it's, you know, significant environmental, and that it's not mitigated and things like that. You know, is there an endangered species on the property that will be harmed or is it just rabbits and deers? Things like that, that do it. I mean, it's helpful to make sure that you get the testimony in there either way of the issues that concern you, and everyone's different, Some of the stuff, the utilities are there, so that's not an issue. Often around here in the rural areas, that's, you've got the questions of your septic, particularly along the coast, How is that going, is that satisfactorily accounted for? So it's something you got to balance, and that's why, at least in this country, that's why we have a board of people like you doing it, as opposed to a lot of other countries where there'd just be one person who would, check the box yes or no, stamp approve or denied.
So I think in the last meeting you said, because the state has stormwater, wetlands, and outs, it doesn't leave us a whole lot to sort of say, here's an environmental impact that we can sink our teeth into. It's,
Except for quantity. As DEM has stated many times, they're all about water quality, but they don't regulate water quantity.
But what about land that's above carrying capacity? What does that even mean?
That's a CRMC term that,
Right, I mean, it has to be based on what the stuff, you need to have restrictions based on, the key thing is at least the underlying calculation should be objective. If there's a carrying capacity, it should be based on a scientific study that's determined this is the carrying capacity for this land. Because, the nitrogen loading, should not be more than X for this particular property because of what it's going to do to the downstream ponds and wetlands.
do you know how CRMC came up with those in their special area management plans? They use that term, developed beyond carrying capacity. Is that a reason to deny a project?
I don't know that it could be on its own, but I think it could be part of it. So I don't specifically know, and I think that's the point, to have what's the expert testimony, what's that based on, and why is that so, and why should this be denied because of it? The other thing is to have the stuff ahead of time. I mean, I feel like I keep coming back to the same thing, but one of the good things, is having your service boundaries and having, capacities, one area within where you have the infrastructure and another carrying capacity areas for where it's outside the infrastructure. And making sure that people know that that's there, that's the rule, that's it ahead of time. So nobody has an excuse to say, well, I didn't know it was there, I didn't know I couldn't do it. Everybody else around me is here. It's like, well, wait a minute, there's a line on the map, and you're on this side of the map, so the answer is no. I'm going to go back here to deliberation. Conclusions of law, those are less likely to affect you, but you might have them there. Conditions of approval, you really don't need the word because in conditions of approval, but they certainly can help as to why you're requiring that particular condition. Like we were saying, on the traffic study, that a condition of approval that it be expanded to such and such an intersection because we believe the planning board is not convinced that the distribution of traffic from the morning peak is correct by the applicant. But the most important thing is just make sure that you keep track of all those and get them in the decision, get them in the written decision. And then we also talk about this best practice tip. It helps to get these conditions recorded on the site plan as well as the decision, because sometimes, future property owners will look at the plan, but they won't look at the decision. Some will look at the decision and not the plan, but others will look at the plan and not the decision. So, 20 years from now, these no-cut buffers, someone will look at the plan and see a crosshatch area on their, across their lot, but they won't know what it means. Particularly if you're putting any kind of condition about no future subdivision. Get it out there, get those conditions out there. And when in doubt, if it moves, record it. That's kind of my move, my view, where I'd say when in doubt, record it. So, that at least is the best thing we have today to try to get these things to continue down, is to record it. and hope that, somewhere down the line in the future, someone who's buying the property is getting a mortgage, and so they have a title company and they're reading the restrictions and know about it. That's the best thing that you can do. There is an element of hope in it, but we do whatever we can to set it up for success. What is a decision? Wait a minute. Oh, I see. Did that? Oh, okay. All right. I'm sorry. I'm not taking full advantage of of the PowerPoint here versus the paper. The best practice tip was there. Okay. So a decision, okay, conclusion, that's it. Decisions, voting, approval, denial. I think we've gone through all that stuff pretty much. Make sure you have everybody's recorded by name and vote. So even if you do it as a voice vote and it's unanimous, the minutes should indicate every individual's vote. And don't hesitate to do it as a roll call vote. So, or a show of hands, whatever, to make sure. I prefer that, particularly if you've got any kind of large crowd, don't do a voice vote. They don't understand what's going on in the crowd. Let them see what the vote is. At the very least, do it by a show of hands so they can see what the vote is.
Andy, one question, motion, second discussion.
Yep.
This has come up, and different attorneys like to handle it different ways based on how comfortable they feel with case law. A lot of instances on occasion with a big project, you'll have staff, an assistant with legal is pre-drafting motions. The commission's deliberating the application, reviewing a motion. There's a motion, there's a second. And a lot of times on discussion, questions will arise where planning board members go back to staff and it's more than a one-word answer. I've always been taught, at least as a professional, I'm more comfortable if someone retracts their motion, their second, then asks all the questions they need of the staff again, and then go back to the motion. Because my perspective is the discussion is amongst the planning board, and if it's not a simple one-word, is that a period or a comma in your second, sentence? But if they're asking the planning staff, engineer, or legal, more in-depth opinion, I've always felt more comfortable of retracting the motion, having that discussion, than putting the motion back on the table.
I think it can go either way. I don't think it really makes a difference. I mean, technically under Robert's rules, which is why I don't like them for this sort of thing, but you're not supposed to be discussing it if you don't have a motion on the table. So I kind of actually prefer, it's not really that important, but I would prefer to just keep the motion on the table so that it doesn't get forgotten and that you're in deliberation and there's a motion there. You may have to go back and say, what was that motion if it had other stuff? You may have amendments to the motion that go along with it, but I think it's okay to be part of the deliberation.
What we try to do is to, before anyone makes a motion to approve or deny, we have a thorough discussion of the motion so that we can
As I said,
approve it
that's
if
fine.
need be.
It doesn't
Makes
really
it
matter
easier
either way.
for
It's a
us.
preference thing. We have a little best practice tip of, don't read the whole draft decision. Make sure that the draft decision is available for people. If it's not online ahead of time, have copies here so that the public can see it, but then you can just reference it. You don't have to read the whole thing into the record.
And we don't usually necessarily read the entire thing, but we do read the first paragraph and then reference conditions, findings.
Right, yep, that's fine. And you might want to go through all the conditions. And part of it may be depending on the audience that's here or whatnot. You might want to, just so that they know it. So, key traits of a solid decision: rational, logically ordered, references standards, easy to follow, professional, legally defensible. Obviously, that's my big concern, that it's legally defensible. So that, you know, you're making the decision rather than some judge. Questions of a solid decision on timelines. This is the zoning board, which you don't need. And this is the planning board, but you know, it's all going to change this year. I doubt these timelines are going to be the same ones in effect by June. So all I'll say is just, that's what your staff is for. They should be doing it, and I think you do. Your staff report, don't you? You have the deadline for decision right on the staff report of each item, which I think is great. It's right there for everybody, right smack in their eyes, so they know, you know, what's the timeline that you're working with. Assure that everyone understands what was approved and the meaning of any conditions attached. That kind of gets back to what we were talking about. It might be a good idea sometimes, depending on what the discussion has been with, if there are a lot of neighbors or whatnot, to in fact go over the conditions publicly so that the people in the room know that. The staff can only enforce what's recorded in the decision, so it's got to be there. Use plain English. Avoid legal and technical terms unless your lawyer tells you to use them. Where appropriate, consider using bullets rather than full sentences. I don't agree with that. But, you know, I think it's better. Lots of times it becomes confusing with bullet points. Do keep your sentences short. I recommend everybody should at least once a year read something by Ernest Hemingway, preferably like one of his early short stories. Keep your sentences short. And review your language for clarity, to make sure. Revise to use fewer words. I think the clarity is more important than fewer, you know, and make sure that there's guidelines. I mean, you're not doing it here, but I can't tell you how many times, you know, a zoning board will approve something subject to the applicant providing appropriate landscaping along the eastern border. And it's like, what the heck is someone going to do to enforce appropriate landscaping in the future? You know, make a decision, you know, shall plant arborvitae of at least 4 feet in height at planting on 3-foot centers along the eastern boundary. You know, just specify so that there's something objective that people can enforce in the future. Land use review process, we've kind of gotten into this. I'm kind of, because we jumped ahead and we talked about the standards, and particularly for the planning board. So this is just talking about the standards. Standards for the zoning boards, we didn't talk about the last time, and I don't know, we don't have anybody here, so I'll just be kind of real quick to give you the fact. So zoning boards have basically kind of like 3 different levels of approval. They have a special use permit, which is this something, it's a permitted use. This use we think is okay in this zone, but we want a further look at it. The zoning board should look at it. Maybe gas stations and commercial zones. We think gas stations should be in our highway commercial zone, but we want someone looking at it, tanks, where they are, traffic, we want someone doing it. Or fast food drive-up windows or fast food restaurants. Those are special use permits. The standard that the applicant has to prove is essentially that there will be no harm to the surrounding property, no significant harm either to the values or the appropriate use of surrounding property. That's essentially the standards. And then whatever specific standards that the town chooses to put in its ordinance for that special use permit. Like that special use permit for drive-up window may say, you know, you must have queuing for at least 10 cars. You may not exit onto an arterial highway, or whatever they are. Those are the standards that they must meet. Then you have 2 kinds of relief here, which are variances. You have a dimensional variances where the use is the same, but you're asking for something like, you know, the multifamily residential is allowed, but you're supposed to have 20 parking spaces and you only want 15 parking spaces. Or you've got a single-family home and you're supposed to have a 15-foot side yard, but you're putting in a garage and you're only going to have a 10-foot side yard. Those are dimensional variances. And to prove that, you have to, and these standards are changing as we speak as well, but it looks like it's going to stay the same there. The key one, that you'd suffer a hardship amounting to more than a mere inconvenience if if it wasn't granted. And up till now, since 1961, more than a mere inconvenience has always meant like pornography. We know it when we see it. It's been defined and undefined over the years, and who knows what's going to happen this year. But the idea is it's a lesser standard. You don't have to prove that your property is going to be confiscated if you don't get this variance. And that's what a use variance is in the standard there. You want to put a convenience store where only residential is allowed. That requires a use variance. And you're supposed to show that you would suffer a hardship amounting to loss of any beneficial use of your property if it weren't granted. You're probably saying, why do we even have this stuff? Well, we have this because we live in a part of the country where it was developed and heavily developed hundreds of years before zoning came into place. So when zoning is applied, there's naturally a lot of stuff that's non-conforming, doesn't conform to what the regulations are, and it changes over time, and things happen there. So since we live in an area that's already developed before zoning, there would be times when zoning would be confiscatory and a taking of people's property if we enforced it strictly. So the idea is let's have a lay board look at it and determine if there's a reason we should vary the zoning for this particular property. Standards for planning board, we did talk about the last.
Go ahead.
So I've often been long confused about hardship and that word, and I think we've struggled sometimes with some of our decisions where a developer wants to put in 3 houses where only 2 fit, and so he really wants his 3, so we have to potentially reduce setbacks or reduce, buffers or whatever, because there's a hardship if we don't permit him to have his proposed development. What is hardship, and how can we, the lot is small and it's triangular and you don't get to fit all you want to do to it. Is that a hardship because the land looked like that when you bought it, and before you cooked up your ideas, what's a hardship? And how do we balance shoehorning something onto a property and giving all kinds of variances just because it's too big for its I don't understand.
Okay. Well, other than a comp permit, you shouldn't really be dealing with that. You've got various other standards, like with your various compound rule, for residential compounds, and you've got density bonuses that are given for certain amenities and things like that. But the planning board, really, I'm at a loss to think of anything where you would consider hardship. You've got what your rules, and if you're varying setbacks and whatnot, it's based on good planning practice or other elements, other amenities that you are gaining in return for, the increased units and the smaller setbacks. The only thing that comes up where you're essentially acting like a zoning board and giving relief is a comprehensive permit, and even then, hardship should not apply at all. It's essentially there, you're balancing the community's need for affordable housing with the goals of the zoning ordinance and regulations that have other standards. But I don't know where hardship would come in at all for a planning.
I'll try.
It has.
Well, I'll try and clarify. So within the regulations that you're dealing with, the regulations don't term it as variances. So the zoning board has the ability to vary the regulations, to Andy's point, where you have to meet the standard of a hardship. What Susan's referring to is under some of our multi-household development standards and inclusionary zoning, there is sections that use the terminology waiver, that you can waive a very specific section or requirement of the regulations, and I believe there's 2 exemptions. One of them that comes to mind is for good planning. Well, every applicant that comes before you is going to say their plan is being done for the purposes of good planning, and I think Maria and I had this conversation, at least in the last month or two, that it is up to the planning board to determine what good planning is, not the applicant convincing you that it's their opinion it's good planning. So there are some abilities there. I think what's inherent to that discussion, and the reason Susan brings it up, is because of a lot of the things this planning board has been dealing with, as well as the planning department staff, is historic in nature. They are things that were approved 4, 5, 6 years ago in the master plan stages, and now they're finally going to pre-limit. And the developer's saying, well, I showed you this conceptual plan, I showed you it was good planning, I'm vested in this density now, so some of the reasons that you've talked about tonight, because the way the motions were formulated then, the issues the planning board potentially wants to bring up now with regards to good planning or squeezing too much in, were never referred to, mentioned, or discussed during conceptual.
I think Susan and I, without mentioning any specific cases, we are thinking of a specific case where the shape of the lot was mentioned as a hardship, and we were told by council that we could not deny the request because it was a hardship. We couldn't say, too bad, you bought the lot, you knew what you were getting. And I just want to back up for a second. Good planning. So we have a planning expert come in, and we all know who we're talking about, who says, I've studied the neighborhood and I've looked at the densities, and this is good planning, and he's a planning expert. I don't get to disagree with him because he's a planning expert and I'm not. I think.
Well, no, well, you've got your planning experts here, and they can disagree with them, and then that comes, we talked about this the last time, you have two experts that say something different. It's your job, you can judge the credibility of one over the other. And to some extent, you are. The planning board is statutorily constituted, to have this jurisdiction over the comprehensive plan and whatnot. So that's one of the things that you can, in fact, be quasi-expert on as a planning expert, as a member of the planning board.
And again, if I think I understand the project you're referencing, that was already through master plan. Yeah. Not at master. You were dealing, I believe, with prelim. We can talk about stuff, but yeah. But again, yeah.
So in general, I'm not going to really go back into hardship other than to say really, it shouldn't really appeal. It shouldn't be something you would be considering.
So can I disregard that word if it's not a comp permit? And just say, yep, no hardship for you? Like, is it really, that's the only time that we
Yeah,
need
you
to
could,
use the
say,
word?
if someone says this is a hardship, it's like, I don't care, the hardship isn't in a standard here.
So if
Day, I'll take
if unified development review were to become mandatory, would the board then to be,
Yes, then you'd have to be dealing with hardships. And I'll come back and talk to you about it there. But given the time, I'm not gonna, it's a long topic, so I'd rather not get into it if we don't have to at the moment. I'd like to get through with this so we can
yes,
get you your credit and move on. We'll be having we'll have, Planning 202 and 303 and 404 and so forth. I'm just gonna, as I said, we talked about the planning board standards, so I'm skipping over those. Historic district commissions, again, just so you'll know, their real issue is basically to deal with exterior features, not interior features. And the document they issue is very descriptive. It's a certificate of appropriateness. And that's really the standard, is what somebody is proposing. Is this appropriate to the historic character of the structure and the district as a whole? That's what they're looking at. Not going to talk about the demolition standards. The problem is the historic district statute is very old. It's older than the zoning and planning and stuff like that. And it's poorly written and it's outdated, but nobody wants to touch it because we don't want to open Pandora's box. So for the moment, we live with it. Who should write a decision? Best practice, staff, working together with a solicitor. You got that here, so you don't really have that as a a problem, you're not one of these places that doesn't have a good staff. Decision must be recorded in the land evidence records, posted at a visibly public place, and mailed to the applicant. Again, why a decision must be followed by everybody, including future property owners. That's why we talked about putting those conditions on the plan itself as well. And enforcement belongs to the staff. And the better these decisions are, and more specific and well-written, the easier it is for them to do their job enforcing it into the future. I have, for decision writing and general legal writing, I have kind of two roles of thumb, which are contradictory to one another, but they are, one, tell the story. Explain what you're doing. That's why, you know, a lot of legal documents have whereas clauses. Oh, it's those whereas clauses. But that's usually what it is, telling the story. Why did we do what we did is often in that whereas. Or with you, that's the introductory stuff about which plan you were looking at, which version, things like that. Tell the story. And also, again, in your conditions, tell the story. Why are you imposing these conditions? Or even your findings, why are you making those findings? And then the second one, getting back to short sentences and whatnot, is keep it simple, stupid. So if you can combine those and find the sweet spot between them, that's what you need to do. Summary, best of information, et cetera. I think we've pretty much talked about that. And there we are. Yes, good night. So, other questions, last questions. We're not too far over time. If you have another 25 minutes of questions, you can push Jamie off to another night, but. Yeah. Sure.
We got into the discussion of, good planning and things like that. And I just wanted to make the connection between what Andy had talked about in terms of because. It becomes incrementally more important to get to that because anytime you wander into a decision that is subjective, like what is good planning. So just make sure you dot that I and cross that T, because if it comes to a subjective decision being the difference between your decision being upheld or overturned, you need that rationale underneath it to support it.
So if you just bear with us one moment while we switch over computers. If we
While
can,
you're doing that, can I just ask a follow-up to Brian's comment? We have talked about, for a little while, about developing a library within the planning department of good planning publications and books that historically touch upon the different aspects of planning. Is that something that if you made a decision, could you reference something like that or not? You were talking about good
I
planning
think,
or
I
good.
think absolutely you can, and part of the discussion on a recent preliminary application was a development team standing in front of you and using some buzzwords and using some design standards that your staff refuted as not necessarily the appropriate buzzwords or the appropriate principles that have been incorporated into your design. And I could have referenced about 5 books that maybe they should read or evaluate in order to incorporate those principles they used as buzzwords. Again, I think it is absolutely appropriate. If you're familiar with a particular piece of literature or a particular design guideline or a manual, and an applicant is telling you this is good planning because it looks just, we'll use Randall Arendt as an example, and a cluster development, and you're intimately knowledgeable about that book or rule by design or cluster development, ask the question of, but where is your preserved open space? Did you do the full environmental analysis of what shouldn't be developed and what should be developed? There is, literally a 20-step process in Randall Arendt's process before he even cites houses. You know, ask the applicant, I want to see that baseline study that you did before you put a house lot on here. In most instances, you won't see it because they didn't do it. But if they're going to say they did it just like Randall Errant, then ask them to see that baseline data, because I'll probably assure you they didn't do it just like Randall Errant told you should do it. So again, you know, both, you know, Brian and Jay, where I'm constantly sending them occasional articles or, you know, things to read and look at, and we'll continue to do that and try, you know, every day we try and learn something. So, yeah. I don't want to overwhelm you.
We like homework. Homework's good. Makes us smarter.
So I have, I would say, about a half an hour, and my intent this evening is to continue the discussion we started in February on mixed-use development and the interrelationship between pyramidal Euclidean zoning, mixed-use, form-based code, and talk again about the visualization of that. We talked a little bit in February about mixed-use development, both what it means to do mixed use horizontally and to do mixed use vertically. And I'll show you some examples around New England of what the original land area looked like, its placement within the community, the initial renderings, and the actual built environment. And this is really just background information for our next step. We have a draft RFQ ready to go perhaps in the next week or so. We're trying to time it with the some of the best architects and urban planners that you've seen the talent in the books are going to be in Charlotte, North Carolina, just after Memorial Day. So I do not want to have the deadline for the RFQs to come back that week or right before they're all going to participate in that. So I have to time it appropriately because some of those firms are taking their entire staff. Some firms are 6 to 8 deep, some are 30 deep, and they take their entire staff to their national conferences. So again, timing-wise. The RFQ that is going out is for the evaluation of the eastern portion of Main Street and Old Tower Hill and how those areas can be redeveloped. Initially looking at the visualization of that, of what would be appropriate from a design perspective, and also looking at the economic viability of any redevelopment of that area. You know, can that area with today's economy and potential growth in the region as well as the town support an additional 100,000 square feet of something, an extra 1 million square feet of something, an extra 2 million square feet of something? Can it absorb 100 units or 1,000 units? Just because you write the regulation and you plan for the future doesn't mean that the economy can bear any development. So there's kind of a 2 or 3 prong approach to our RFQ. That we want to make sure that what you're looking for from a visual standpoint, there's some financial marketing background behind it to understand that if you have this particular vision, you would like the area to be redeveloped in that fashion, that the marketplace can actually support it. Otherwise, the drawings and the renderings just become 100% aspirational, and it just won't happen. And in some aspects, it's good to know because your aspirational drawings may be aspirational now, but potentially not 5 years from now. So it's a matter of timing and what you want to wait for.
Jamie, before you get into that, just want to give a reminder that related to several projects which shall not be named. In the past, the board has strongly suggested a modification to our setbacks from multifamily housing to give us greater flexibility in some of these designs that we felt we did not have the ability to improve.
Right. So the first development that I'm showing you is on Route 20 in Shrewsbury, Mass., which is just the east of Worcester. If everybody is familiar with the area, this site used to be home to Spags, which was a forerunner to Ocean State Job Lot, Dollar Tree, and Dollar General, and even Walmart. This site sat vacant for almost 15 years after Spags went out of business, and the community wanted to redevelop it. Again, this is very commercial, not necessarily like some of the areas in South Kingstown. This is a process during construction, and this is the redevelopment of that. This is classified as a decent model for mixed use. It is horizontal, though. Horizontal meaning that the residential is in the rear of the property, and you'll see the white roofed buildings. There's a pool right here, so these are residential to the rear. This is Whole Foods, CVS, there's some elevation changes. This is inline commercial. Again, a sea of parking. So again, this is a horizontal example. This is just an example of what that looks like. You know, there's no intent of our department to use these as representative of what could be built or should be aspirational in town. It's just an example of someone who uses the term mixed use, but doesn't set the table with what type of mixed use it is. This is literally a big box Whole Foods surrounded by inline strip, surrounded by 4- and 5-story residential.
I take it this is before the advent of green infrastructure?
This is an urban site. They actually have less pavement than they originally did, because you can see that is literally, this is about a 18-acre site, so in its entirety, and originally about 16 of the 18 acres were paved. So, and again, this is in a more urban setting on Route 20, so they had to rely on underground storage within their parking lots. So if you look at the development photo, you do not see detention basins. It's all under the parking lot.
So can I ask you about this? So to me, I look at it, I say, oh, so much parking. But a lot of the parking's full. So if you were to keep the stores and the residences in the geometry where they are, is there a way to reduce that amount of surface parking without going up a layer?
Well,
It's-
what's interesting is, you know, we have the discussion on the transportation side about mixed uses. So this is Whole Foods with a full parking lot. So that's a good observation. But here's the residential, and it's about a quarter full. So if there was a way in this development to integrate the residential a little more closely with the commercial, you, in all likelihood, could have reduced the parking because Whole Foods closes at 10. So there was an opportunity here, but the way the project was financed, the way the project was built, there are lines. So, you know, this residential to the rear of the property on the northern portion kind of works in isolation to the rest of this. So if we took a photo at midnight, all the parking would be full at the residential, and other than a few restaurant bars that are integrated in here, the parking lot in front of Whole Foods would be completely empty.
That's a really good point. I think we, though, have a formula here for determining how much parking we demand per square foot of retail space. And we have a formula for how much parking we demand for residential density. Are we allowed in our ordinances
Yes,
to share?
yeah, and again, this is
Have the
part,
flexibility?
this is part of the structure of the visualization of what you want your community to look like. And once you decide what you want it to look like and how you want it integrated, we can write the regulations to try and codify that vision to allow for shared parking. You could do one or two things here. You could actually increase the density if you had better utilization of shared parking, or you maintain the existing density and reduce the amount of surface parking that you see. So it could go either way. You could have actually got more things here if you better utilize shared parking, or the site got smaller with less parking.
But does
and
that
more
mean you
green
needed,
space.
does that mean you needed to have a master plan where you could visualize this entire?
Yeah, and
'Cause
I'll
if
show
somebody-
you some
If
examples
somebody
of that.
built that Whole Foods with, I don't know, whatever that other thing is, and then 5 years later put in the residential behind it, you know?
And some of it is price point, because there's a Whole Foods in West Hartford, Connecticut, that's part of Blueback Square, that has parking under the Whole Foods, so the parking lot for Whole Foods is half the size, because half of that parking lot is underneath the store. But that was a price point on land value, and they only had a site, they couldn't go horizontal. So in that Whole Foods, there's a vertical integration, being the parking lot underneath the store. So there are examples of how to do it differently. And I'll go through a few of those examples. This is a site in Wayland, Massachusetts on Route 20. If you actually started in Worcester or you can start in Sturbridge and further in Western Mass and continue through Worcester, through Shrewsbury and end up in Wayland, Mass. This is a site that's, again, termed as mixed use. It was probably, and I'll show you the original drawings for this. It was a redevelopment, and it's a redevelopment of this 1960-ish strip center where that grocer went out of business. So you have a lot of pavement and you have commercial on the easterly side of this development. This is that master plan phase that you talked about, Susan, or mentioned, where you're seeing a large grocer anchored in the corner. You're seeing the faux Main Street. You're seeing two, this is townhouse, kind of single-family appearance in the northeast corner. This is larger apartment style in the northwest corner. There was supposed to be a town hall element here, restaurant pad, and again, Main Street. This is a rendering of what that was intended to look like. First floor retail, office space, street interactions, second floor office and residential. Again, you can see this from this rendering that you have a significant second story integration of office and residential. That is the town green. It's kind of interesting here, there's a sunken section that they actually flood and can make into a skating rink in the winter, because hockey and skating in the Boston Metro is still very important. This is what the site looks like today. In the foreground, this is a Panera Bread, and I'll show you the rendering for that. It's very similar to what it was originally rendered at. This is a one-story building with some office space above. You continue down Main Street, and if you can see from this photo, a little bit difficult, there is no second floor component. And on the left side of Main Street, it's all first floor. There's actually a True Value hidden in the middle of this development within the Main Street kind of cute architecture.
There's no trees.
There are trees, so and I think Maria alluded to it on a picture that she saw earlier. The wonderful trees that you see in this rendering, they're all there, except they're only 4 years old, and they started at 2-inch caliber. It takes a good 15 years for a sunset maple, a sugar maple. There are some varieties that in 15 years will be 35, 40 feet tall. Some of your elm hybrids, but then they get so big in year 40 and 50 that they actually can create a problem if not properly placed. So this is the rendering. If we go, anybody familiar with Levittown in New York? They were potato fields 70 years ago. If you go there today, it's mature canopy and park-like settings. But 70 years ago, it looked like this. That will mature over time. You know, the beautiful town greens we see in the city centers, Boston Commons, some of those public parks, all started out like this. So it's just tough. This is what that Main Street looks like. And if you look really closely, Susan, you can see the street tree. It's there. It's in an off, leaf scenario. This was done, these pictures were done in the winter. Here's a rendering of that building, and here's the actual building. So, there is some instances where a rendering actually can represent what a real thing looks like. This is a faux downtown. This is a mixed-use component. It was a good attempt. Remember what they started with? This is what they started with. Yeah, the community gets to decide whether they feel that this is better. They got to approve it. This wasn't a non-controversial plan. This took years for the developer to get approved, and then another number of years for financing until the marketplace allowed this to be built.
So if the planning board approved the renderings that had that second floor, much-needed housing and office space,
Someone had to modify it later on.
so the economy just didn't support that additional,
And again,
building?
that's one of the things about the aspirational aspects, that sometimes the marketplace just can't support that, or the developer feels there is no market for it. So again, it's
the
trying,
board is relying on the developer's judgment that this is what they can afford to build and which the market will support.
and
And so then when you approve this aspirational thing, because we all need affordable housing or whatever kind of housing it was, and then 15 years later, this is what you have with no housing, that's unfortunate. But the board,
but
we,
There's enough information out there now to show the need for housing. And if you really want to have mixed use and have everything integrated, it needs to be at least 2 stories.
yeah. So again, it's, this community did, went into this eyes wide open. The developer just didn't come back and build it without going back to them to get an amendment to their previously approved plan. But this is a multi-million-dollar project. It does serve commercial value. There are 2, you'll just see in the bottom left-hand corner, there's a significant residential component. If I go back to the aerial, I have an aerial today. That's what it looks like today. So you have a substantial residential component here, and these are connected. There's sidewalks, street trees, street lines, sidewalks to the entire development. There is not a disconnect. They didn't get the second floor above Main Street.
So we were talking earlier, before the meeting started, about, I think, a phased development in East Lyme,
Yes,
maybe something.
that's one of my examples
okay.
at the end. I do have that. So this is an example, and this one is in Wesleyan, Mass. So again, very kind of suburban, urban area for Massachusetts. This is the T is right here. Strip development, and again, they had an older, I'll try and blow it out, I have a larger. This was the 1960, 1970 development, large buildings back, parking up front, and they had a number of businesses that moved out. The developer looked at, redeveloping it. This is what it ended up turning out to be. So it anchored, but there, in most aspects, these mixed-use redevelopments have a significant anchor tenant, whether it's Whole Foods, Trader Joe's, Super Stop and Shop, Shaw's, Star Market. There always needs to be a significant anchor to be able to have the developer make the leap of faith. Otherwise, it's all residential, because they can always make the leap of faith all residential. But if you want that commercial mix, they're usually looking for one significant tenant. Again, this is a horizontal integration, not vertical, anchored by a grocer, inline strip. But what was important to this community is they had this kind of Main Street fabric as you headed both east and west along their main boulevard here. So they wanted to get rid of the sea of parking, and their exchange was, let's hide the sea of parking behind buildings built close to the road. So for most aspects, unless you're at this intersection and you head west, you will not along Linden Street, the parking for the grocer disappears behind the buildings that have been brought up to the street.
And you do have the strip with the trees and then the sidewalk beyond it, which is definitely
Yes.
a good design element.
Yeah, and again, you feel and again, if you look at the model for Old Tower Hill, we have a different model where the pedestrian experience here, even though it's a high-volume road, is different than an experience elsewhere. Again, just an up-close picture of that. Again, Maria, that was a good observation, and here they utilized on-street parking because they were able to utilize traffic calming. This used to be 2 lanes north, 2 lanes south, and now it's 1 lane west, 1 lane east with turning lanes at the intersections. And that allowed them to add that green landscaping with street trees, as well as move the sidewalk off the road. Again, that is, this is our town. This is our town. So to put things in perspective, this is, I believe we're 14 acres total for that development. So I just want to put you in perspective of what, a site like this looks like that can become this, and whether you agree or disagree with that, but there are opportunities along the street. There are still opportunities in the redevelopment along that corridor. It's our site. This is a site in East Lyme. Paul Jordan referenced this. This is called Gateway Commons. It was designed as a mixed-use development. Here is the layout. You have, again, a significant anchor. There was supposed to be that beautiful Main Street, quintessential New England architecture. You have some single-family townhouse as well as large apartment buildings that were there. The reason there's a disconnect here, there's some topography and some wetlands in this little valley. So again, developer sold the community on building this whole traditional neighborhood district design. And here's what the site is today. It is Costco. Here's downtown. Everybody see it? It's right here. Right? Not built yet. But you got Costco, got the Costco gas station, and then you got all the housing. So where my view as a planner they potentially failed is you get the housing and you get Costco, but I can't wait for this, Or the community understands because of market conditions, this can't get built until this happens, plus a number of X number of units. If anybody's familiar, this is I-95, Flanders Four Corners, Route 165, Niantic, Main Street of East Lyme is just about 2 miles south on Long Island Sound. So a similar, somewhat scenario where you have a vibrant downtown commercial area. You don't want to design a secondary community that competes with your existing downtown. But again, it's understanding the phasing, and Paul mentioned that. How do you put the developer on the hook that if you're going to do this, that you just don't get the big box and you don't get all the other stuff that actually got you to buy in to the traditional neighborhood mixed-use development.
But what's the board to do? Yeah.
You build it into the regulatory side that there's proportionality. I worked in a community that had a redo of 1 million square feet of office complex that was a sub-corporate headquarter to a large insurance entity. The development was primarily residential, but it had another 20,000 square feet of retail. The developer was relatively adamant early on about the fact that they couldn't build the retail until they built the residential. I'm one of those skeptical planners who would say, well, once you build all the residential, how do I come back and get you to build the commercial? What do I do? Give you a notice violation and ask you to, stop occupying your 320 residential units because you failed to build your 20,000? So what we did is we tiered the project and we wrote it into the regulations and then we reinforced it into the approval. You only were released X number of residential units. And then when you built the commercial space, we added units. When you built more commercial space, we added units. When you built more commercial space, you added units. Market conditions in this community were difficult. One part of one of the commercial buildings that was built 5 years ago remains vacant, yet all of the residential is filled. So again, it's not for lack of trying on the developer. The market conditions for the amount of retail associated with over 200 residential units in this community cannot support the commercial space. And actually, the developer tried at one point in time to go back to the town and take the vacant commercial space and convert it to 8 apartment units. And the town initially said no. I haven't checked on the status lately, but they did say no, because market conditions at some point will support that commercial.
On one of your previous slides that had the corner that showed, I think it was called Linden Place, hopefully because they actually planted linden trees, is a good example of placemaking and a public gathering space that is so integral to the
Yeah, and
success of these kinds of.
it's a small effort, but it's a recipe for cover for someone walking, for someone waiting for the bus, for kids getting dropped off, for pizza, ice cream.
It's a nice change of scale.
It is, yeah.
Yes.
It is, except this could be in any state, in any neighborhood in America. There's nothing,
Well, we would tailor it, of course, to our coastal village
I hope so.
design.
I'd like to see it, it's very Wellesley. I mean,
It is,
it's
yeah,
very
actually.
high-end, and it's sort of
So
historic.
But it's I think a cookie cutter of, they could put that anywhere and it would look just like the same thing.
But a lot of communities look similar to other communities. So and again, if anyone's familiar with this area, in this area, you could pick this up in Wellesley and drop it in Weston. You could drop it in Natick. You could go one more town west and drop it in Framingham. And if you upscaled it a little bit, you could drop it in Brookline. If you made it more rural country, you could go north of the 128 corridor and drop it in Weston and go further out in Wellesley. Wellesley is an extremely wealthy suburb of Boston, and that was the first mixed-use development called Town Place Center, without the town municipal building yet, but there is a place for a new town hall there. And if you go into Weston, Weston is somewhat similar on a suburban scale, not necessarily price point, because a lot in Weston may be $2 million. But they have a very nice downtown that they're looking to reinvigorate, reimagine, and redo with very historic turn-of-the-century town greens that are on the east and west side of their downtown. So they're going through a similar analysis and similar study with consultants of how you do infill, how you balance the commercial and residential space within a downtown, how you deal with parking, and how you establish the architectural vernacular so that it doesn't look like it belongs in another community, whether it be even Newport or Narragansett or Lincoln. There is, you have an eclectic mix of architecture in town, so there's a uniqueness here. Again, this is just an example of another community try and take what you see as traditional strip development, similar to a Shaw's in town, where a urban design firm looked at what could happen at the street. Now, I'm not saying this is South Kingstown, but this is someone's interpretation of what could be done differently to a 1950, 1960, 1970 traditional strip with 5 acres of parking and 100,000 square feet of retail behind it. You know, again, you will go through this process. You will get a say. You will be at design charrettes with the designers, trying to articulate and be able to say, no, that looks not like us. But again, us is a lot of things to different people, you know. And then I think I have one more for you. This is West Hartford, Connecticut. Very vibrant, middle, urban, suburban area. Some dense areas, some very suburban areas. This is just off of Down Street on LaSalle. This is a parking lot. The town of West Hartford encourages infill, and they had a developer look at doing some infill here. Again, they acquired 2 single-family homes on a side road, just off of LaSalle, but they, for some reason, could not acquire Lot 10. So there was one holdout on the block. So they are proposing 2 buildings, Building A and Building B. Building A is roughly 169 feet by 223, and Building A is 80 by 90. And again, it's a little bit of a parabola, so one side's 70, one side's 94, so I averaged the 2. This is the main building. Building A does have parking, ground floor and first floor, and Building B, which is at the corner, does not. You'll see the holdout of the house, which is right here on the top left part of the screen. Again, subsurface parking, and Building B is at the corner of the street. This is just a quick elevation of Building A. This is a rendering of Building B. Again, this is in a more urban setting than what South Kingston has. This is how it sits on the site. This is by far the largest building that they will see in this portion of downtown. There's a project a few blocks away that is 6 stories, and the biggest group against that luxury apartment complex were the people who lived in 3 buildings next door that were also 6 stories. But they thought the building that was going to be new next to them was too big. Yet the 3 buildings far surpassed their size. And again, this is so you understand to not just use the term mixed use, because this is mixed use. This is the integration of first floor retail, first floor office, and second floor residential, third floor, fourth floor. So it's all about scale. This is the small Tudor home that is going to be flanked on the north and east by a 4-story building and a 6-story building.
So Jamie, the examples that you've shown, although you're trying to demonstrate mixed use versus segregated uses, aren't really at the same scale and sensibility as South Kingstown.
Right, so we go back to the things we looked at in February. When I get there, where we talked about buildings more like this, where that was a street corner, and this is the replacement of that. That, I think, that is more scale appropriate, potentially architectural appropriate, than the last set of buildings I showed you in West Hartford. So that's the discussion that you have to dive deep on when the consultant is before you, working with you on articulating a vision for South Kingstown. So you understand utilizing some of the slides that you don't like and you don't want your community to become, and utilizing some of the things that you may want your community to become. And there are 1-story versions of this, 2-story versions, 3-story versions, and 4-story versions of this. We looked at this one, that You know, there is probably a generation in South Kingstown, or people who may want to move to South Kingstown, who may not have the same opinion that you may hold of this building. I'm trying to find the appropriate words, because there is a generation that is moving into that, and there is a whole group of developers throughout the country who are building things like that. There is a select group of developers who are building that, and they're only building that because that's what the community demanded, and they demanded it through their regulations. Otherwise, you potentially get that.
And that's
If your
also
regulations are-
Dedham, which is a, you know,
Yeah, no,
suburb of
this-
Boston, which is a completely different.
And again, I showed you where this is. I mean, this is, you know, you could replace that with the old version of Bald Hill and Warwick, or, you know, some of the roads in Cranston, and, you know, that's what was built.
As we're talking about all these things, we're also talking about, you know, Maria mentioned placemaking, connectivity. You know, I always think about Route 2 coming down through Warwick and West Warwick, where you've got huge apartment complexes with a driveway coming out onto Route 2. There's nowhere to walk to. You can't get to the apartment complex next door without driving out onto Route 2 and driving back in again.
And this is you know, we all see these pictures, right? We all see these wonderful pictures, and Susan, you brought it up a few meetings ago, where I understand that picture, I may like that picture, but how long is it gonna take for that picture to come to fruition, right? Because you don't have 50 acres that's vacant, that used to be industrial complex that got torn down, and you're looking for one developer to come in, and it has a half a mile of frontage on two sides of the road, and they can, except for the scale of the landscaping, replicate those buildings. These are gonna happen incrementally over time, and it's potentially gonna look awkward in the beginning. No different than when the first large, really large 3-4-story building was built on Main Street, surrounded by a small, literally blacksmith shop and a cobbler shop, and all of a sudden someone built a 3-story brick building.
But the fact that it's not going to be instantaneous is not an excuse to do nothing.
Correct, and that's why the regulations need to articulate what you want the entire corridor to look like over time, and that becomes aspirational. It just may take time. Again, we look up here, it's 1723. It's 300 years, and this is what you have, and it took 300 years to get to here.
Just to back up to the idea of connectivity, maybe a better example, I think about cul-de-sacs from two subdivisions, right? This one maybe was built 10 years ago, here's the new one. They both have cul-de-sacs that meet, there's a little wooded area, and there's a footpath that all the kids use. And maybe they ride their bikes through there. And I understand people don't want traffic. It drives me crazy that those things. But I mean, planning for that kind of connectivity between subdivisions, between developments, so that people aren't forced out onto the road, that there are options for getting from point A to point B.
Now, what I'll do is I'll send you, I'll send each one of the members the design guidelines in Simsbury, Connecticut, along with the baseline analysis for the form-based code. And when you're doing that analysis, the consultant teams look at each property kind of individually, but also in aggregate, so that if you look at the Shaw's Plaza, you can't just look at it, you have to look at it in a vacuum, and then you have to remove the vacuum and say, if the Shaw's Plaza was ever redeveloped, then potentially someday the Burger King and the car dealership and maybe the bank, someone will acquire those and redevelop those, and I can't have the two cul-de-sacs back to back with a fence between them and only a little gate. How do you develop the interconnectivity so to go from one development to the next development, you don't have to come back on the main street? So a lot of times you'll plan for a secondary ring road on the back side of all the development, or some interconnections in between. There are some larger developments, if you wanted to drive to in Glastonbury, Connecticut, where they're incremental, individual properties, but it was designed in multi-phases on the regulatory side to require the interconnectivity. Now, it took years, but now you don't have to go back on the main road, and you can go from business to business to business to business, or hotel through the back of an office complex to a business, and then back out on the road. So there are still 10 curb cuts, but I don't have to leave every single time I want to go down the street. And again, it's looking at the big picture, but also looking and understanding the fact that there are multiple landowners, and you don't have this aggregate of an old mill complex that is being redeveloped or no longer is there. Any questions?
Questions, comments? Thanks, Jamie. Anyone have time for a brief planning board liaison update? Is your microphone on?
The affordable housing meeting last month was just canceled or postponed due to a lack of quorum.
Actually, Maria, just before you move on, this is one picture. This is from Congress of New Urbanism. It's a small article in their Public Square magazine that comes out electronically monthly. Existing shopping center with 3 different variations of either what a community would want it to redevelop as, or the fact that it takes time. So your tame version is a new kind of center hall project with an anchor, in the middle, right, top right-hand side. Okay, existing building, existing building. As it evolves, the 2 buildings get torn down and this block gets built. As it transforms into that full visualization of what you are articulating as a vision, there's the full build-out. You typically don't go from the top left to the bottom right unless there's extreme market demand and enough vacant land. Right? So you look at Shaw's, McDonald's and the bank are probably not going anywhere for some time. It doesn't mean you shouldn't plan or design for the redevelopment of those 2 pads, as well as the easterly portion of the parking lot. But in all likelihood, you're not going from the top left instantly to the bottom right. There's a process in between. And there may be stops and starts and stalls and delays and a step backwards to move forward. But your aspiration is to go from the top left to some version of the bottom right. I don't know what that version is for you. I have some ideas, but that's why we go through a process.
Interesting reduction in flat roofs and increase in plantings.
And then I'll just end, with we'll say a funny one. I don't think if I used this one before. Again, the term mixed use, European model. I won't tell you which country is the lower one. So, where Europe, the mixed use is more integrated and has been around for a very long time. So.
Village is still also.
Yep.
Thanks, Jamie. Update from staff, status of District 5 application and anything else?
Yeah, so with regards to District 5, we did receive correspondence from their legal counsel granting the planning board an extension to June 1st. So the public hearing was, new notification went out for your regularly scheduled meeting in 2 weeks.
That's still only one meeting.
That's one meeting, so it is staff's recommendation at this point that the planning board look at scheduling a special meeting on I believe it's the 30th which is the 5th. Just bear with me.
So I think we really do, in trying to do that, we need to really check the availability of planning board members, because it's not fair to the board that because the applicant is unwilling to give us 2 additional weeks, that we then should add a meeting to our schedule.
I do not disagree with you, but they granted us an extension to that date. So your next regularly scheduled meeting, sorry, my windows keep opening and closing. Your next regularly scheduled meeting in May is the 23rd. The 29th is a holiday, and the 30th is the 5th Tuesday of the month. Again, I realize it's the day after Memorial Day. The only potential other dates would be the 24th or 25th. Our concern was that potentially in all likelihood, the public hearing portion would close on the 23rd at your regularly scheduled meeting. Staff needs to disseminate the information at that last hearing and finalize drafts for motions for your consideration. If the public hearing closes on the 23rd, you move into that deliberation mode. So you,
30th.
the 30th. Our intent would be provide draft motions for you prior to that weekend, so that you could have time to review the drafts, so that you were prepared to discuss them, and because of timeframes, act on them on the 30th.
Has anything new been submitted, like as far as the design of the building? I know we talked about that.
No new design on the building, no new design on layout.
Do board members know if they are available on the 30th of June? I mean, May?
I mean, I'll make myself available. I guess, Jamie, on this topic, is there anything new that you could discuss, or maybe it's not appropriate now, on the master plan, the notice for the master plan? It seems to me that if we need...
Joe, if I can, the only thing staff is prepared to discuss tonight is the timing of the application associated with the meeting dates.
Okay.
Nothing with regards to the administrative process or the substance of the application.
Certainly.
We will be prepared to discuss that on the 23rd.
So I can do the 30th.
I don't know yet.
Okay.
Robin, Joe, Peter,
What are we going to do, site visit?
we've talked about that.
You all have the ability to walk the site.
Will we know what we see when we get there?
Well, staff is,
That's a good point.
I am
because we
so
talked
shocked
about-
sometimes by what I see that I've approved and what I thought it looked like on paper. Are we going to get out there and, like, is there a way to, is it marked? Can we spray paint it? Like, is there some way to know?
Talked about that.
staff is more than willing to meet with any individual on the site to walk them through the site plan.
But I think we specifically, when we discussed having a site visit early on, we asked if the area could be flagged or delineated in some fashion so that we could better understand where things might be on the site. Does everyone remember that? You know, and the unwillingness to give us 2 weeks and then nothing as far as follow-up with the site visit, that's really unfortunate.
Again, it is on your agenda for the 23rd. There was one additional item that if you hold the special meeting on the 30th, we potentially have what would hopefully be a potential short conversation with the planning board. We did receive an application for an amendment to the Magnolia Lane project. because they have a conflict with utilities and the placement of a transformer box, so they are requesting the relocation of their driveway access.
So you're saying it would be a special meeting for more than one item? They can't wait until the June meeting?
They have asked if there is a special meeting, whether they can be accommodated. They're on the TRC agenda.
What does our May agenda look like for other items? You know, to be practical.
Primarily 5A. District 5, sorry, District 5 apartments.
So it's unlikely that we would have additional applications come in that were complete between now and then?
Correct.
You know, it's just, it's an issue of, I think, practicality and fairness. You know, obviously, we all want to do a good job, and back to Andy's point about try to avoid getting into an argument with anyone in the audience. Well, certainly the attorneys for the applicant sometimes make life very difficult for the board, who is just trying to be thorough and do a good job. And
So again, we have an extension to June 1st. Your next regularly scheduled meeting's on the 23rd, and if possible, we'd recommend a meeting on the 30th. Otherwise, you would need to deliberate and make a decision on the 23rd.
I don't know if we'd be ready for that. I wouldn't feel ready for that. Have
Well,
everybody votes yes?
how can staff develop a motion if we haven't yet received all the information or had the conversation? I mean, they say, for example, that you may have received electronic information, but there has not been deliberation on certain topics. So how can staff then?
We would do our best. We would do our best to formulate the framework for a motion and work on it that evening to finalize it if you could not hold a special meeting.
Right, but with the special meeting, we would get all this testimony in
Close the hearing.
23rd, close the.
Potentially close the hearing. The developer could walk in and hear something that says, I'll give you more time because we want more time.
Then you've got 7 days, well, then we have till the 30th, you can make your motion and we talk about it then.
You have 7 days to evaluate all of the testimony up until the 23rd. We potentially have 2.5 days to finalize and get draft motions framework to you.
But if we close the hearing, I'm all in favor of closing the hearing so that we can just make quick work of that special meeting. But if after a week, after we've heard everything, and you go home and ruminate on it, if the hearing's closed, we won't have that opportunity now to ask more questions of the developer, right?
No.
And is it a good practice to make the assumption that we're going to close a hearing on a specific date? Or?
No. You could decide to keep the hearing open to June 1st, but you do not have any time past June 1st.
We'll have to follow Andy's model of short to the point sentences, won't we?
I'm sorry. Counsel Peter's available on the 30th. I do note the 31st is being held for a possible zoning board extra meeting I don't know if that's happening or not. I think it's just their hold. But the 30th is available.
Is what it is.
I think we don't have a choice.
To get that decision,
We can
we have held, we have reserved council chambers for the 30th.
Well, I would hope that we can get a full representation if possible, if planning board members' schedules allow for it, for that meeting. Okay.
Thank you.
Any update on legal issues? Very good.
Sentence.
Motion to adjourn. Second? All those in favor say aye. Aye. Motion carries unanimously.
The audience said.